There is a threshold within the human being that civilization has spent millennia trying to convince itself does not exist. A point beyond hunger, beyond cold, beyond accumulated despair, where everything we call humanity simply ceases to function. Philosophers debate where this threshold lies. Psychologists try to map it in the laboratory. But in May 1933, on a swampy island in the middle of the Obi River, in deep Siberia, 6,000 people discovered where it is. What happened on the other side of that threshold is one of the most disturbing truths our species has ever produced. The Soviet Union of 1933 was a state at war with itself. Joseph Stalin had consolidated power with speed. The repressive apparatus he built did not need real culprits. It needed categories. The broadest and most dangerous classification of all was that of a socially harmful element. This category could include former merchants, children of landowners, people without fixed employment, beggars, prostitutes, petty criminals. Anyone the local bureaucracy decided did not fit the profile of the productive Soviet citizen that the ideology demanded. It was not necessary to commit a crime. It was only necessary to exist in a way that the state considered inconvenient. Stalin's plan for these undesirables had its own logic that would be almost admirable in its coldness. Siberia was vast, depopulated, and the Soviet project needed labor to colonize and exploit those remote regions. The solution was to transport the undesirables to the Siberian interior and turn them into agricultural settlers. They would clear the land, grow food, build structures, and if they died, well, they were socially harmful elements. What the planners in Moscow never seriously bothered to calculate was what happens when you dump thousands of human beings into an environment that cannot sustain them. The 6,000 who were to be sent to Natsino Island began their journey in Moscow and other Western cities. Many did not know where they were going. Many did not know what they were accused of. They were pushed into closed train cars, the famous cattle cars that the Soviet system used to transport deportees, without adequate sanitation, with minimal food. The journey lasted weeks. Inside the cars, the air became unbreathable from human bodies, waste, and diseases. People died inside the cars during transport. The bodies were removed at stops and left behind, and the train continued. When the trains arrived in western Siberia, the deportees were transferred to barges on the Obi River. The barges were equally overcrowded and equally devoid of any adequate provisions. The Obi River in May still carries the cold of the thaw, and nighttime temperatures dropped 2 points that killed people. More deaths during river transport, more bodies left behind or thrown into the river. When the barges finally stopped and the guards ordered disembarkation, the survivors emerged into the light of a piece of land. Natsino Island is approximately 1.5 kilometers long and less than 600 meters wide. It was a swampy sandbank covered in mud and low vegetation, without trees large enough to build any kind of shelter. Surrounded by the icy waters of the Obi and by armed guards that the NKVD had positioned on the banks to prevent any escape, 6,000 people were disembarked on this piece of land on May 18, 1933. What the Soviet state had provided to sustain them was a quantity of raw cereal flour, delivered without containers to cook it, without instruments to measure or distribute it, and where making fire was almost impossible due to the absence of material and constant rain. The distribution of flour was the first collapse. There was no system. The guards dumped the flour on the ground, and the crowd of 6,000 hungry and desperate people rushed upon it. Those who managed to get portions of flour mixed it with river water, which was unfit for consumption, laden with contaminants and organisms that a digestive system already weakened by weeks of deprivation could not process. Dysentery began within days. Then came typhus. Then came the other infections that multiply where there is human concentration. People died on the bank. They died in the groups where they had gathered trying to protect themselves from the cold. They died alone, away from the group, where they had gone because being with other human beings had become more dangerous. In the first few days, the daily death toll was already in the dozens. In the first full week, the smell over the island had changed. It was the smell of accumulated death, of bodies that were not buried, because there were no tools to dig, and because the people who were still alive had no energy to perform this task for the dead. And then began what the surviving reports would classify with the bureaucratic euphemism of food-related disturbancy, but which the survivors and the few gods who spoke would describe with the direct language of what it truly was. Cannibalism on Natsino Island did not begin as an isolated event. practiced by a disturbed individual. It developed as a survival strategy that spread because the environment had systematically removed all other options. The first cases involved bodies of people already dead. Then, the line between waiting for death and anticipating the death of another began to dissolve. Survivors described the emergence of organized groups, not solitary individuals acting on impulse, but groups that hunted other groups. People who still had some remaining physical strength, identifying those who were weaker and more isolated. One of the most detailed accounts that reached the archives was that of an NKVD guard named Kasper. He described a young woman who had been captured by a group and tied to a tree. She was still alive when the group members began to remove parts of her body. The guard reported hearing her screams from across the water. His position was to guard the bank to prevent escapes, not to interfere. This account is not exceptional in the documentation of Nassim. It is representative. There were children among the deportees, and the accounts mention what happened to many of them with a brevity that is itself a form of horror. There were people who went mad before dying, who walked in circles or stood motionless looking at the river, and whose mental collapse protected them in the sense that they ceased to be present for what surrounded them. And there were those who remained lucid and made the choices that the environment offered them, on a spectrum ranging from letting die to killing. In June, weeks after the initial disembarkation, Soviet authorities sent an official named Vasily Veliko to assess the situation. The report he produced was the primary document about what happened in Natsino, and its existence is in itself an anomaly. Veliko described what he found with a precision that made it impossible to classify the event as a series of accidents. He named what it was: a total collapse produced by the deliberate abandonment of human beings without the minimum means of survival. He documented cannibalism. He documented the death toll. He documented the conditions of the survivors. And then his report went into the NKVD archives, where it remained classified for almost 60 years. The survivors of Natsino, approximately 2,000 of the original 6,000, were eventually transferred to other forced colonization points. Many died in the following months from diseases contracted on the island. Those who reached safe destinations were forbidden to speak. The event that would become informally known among survivors as the Island of Death had no official existence. It had not happened. Velichko's report emerged from the Soviet archives only after the collapse of the Soviet Union. When historian Irina Flige arrived in the region and interviewed the few survivors who were still alive in the 90s, she found elderly people who had carried those memories for 60 years in imposed silence. Natsino Island was not an accident. It was the direct result of a system that processed human beings as administrative units, that transformed the bureaucracy of cruelty into routine to the point where no individual needed to make the decision to kill. The decision was distributed in hundreds of dispatches, transfer orders, deportation quotas, and transport reports, where the word dead appeared among statistics in the same way as the word delivered. The cannibalism that emerged on the island was not the darkest part of the Nazino story. It was the visible and documentable consequence of a much more abstract, much colder, and much more deliberate decision, made far from that island by men who would never have to smell the air of that place. This is what totalitarian systems do when they reach their purest form. They do not, suddenly and dramatically, turn perpetrators into monsters. They distribute cruelty in enough administrative layers so that no individual hand feels the full weight of what all hands together are doing. If you want to continue learning about the stories that power preferred to bury for decades, subscribe to the Shadow AI channel now and activate the bell so you don't miss any videos. And before you go, comment below. Do you think cannibalism in Natsino was an act of individual madness, or the inevitable result of a system that removed all humanity? Read the answers in the comments, because this question has no easy answer, and the ones people give reveal a lot about us.